The private dining room at the Contemporaneo, one of Rio de Janeiro's most exclusive restaurants, was a study in understated wealth. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking panorama of the city's glittering lights, a view that usually filled me with a quiet sense of accomplishment. Tonight, however, I felt a knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. It was the official engagement dinner for my son, Alex, and his fiancée, Sophia Ashworth. I sat beside my wife, Eleanor, feeling a bit like a museum piece, an artifact from a simpler, less ostentatious era. The Ashworths, Sophia's family, were not just wealthy, they were a dynasty, their names synonymous with old money and effortless power. My own success, built from scratch in the construction industry, felt rustic and unpolished in their rarefied air. The conversation flowed around us, a river of talk about yachting in the Mediterranean, ski chalets in Gstaad, and art auctions in London. Alex, my son, was completely captivated, laughing a little too loudly at Mr. Ashworth's jokes, his eyes shining with the reflected glamour of his new family. He had been assimilated. Sophia, his fiancée, was polite but distant, her attention almost entirely focused on her own parents, as if we were distant relatives she was required to tolerate for the evening. Eleanor and I were an island. Our attempts to engage in the conversation met with polite, but brief, smiles before the topic inevitably shifted back to their world, a world we had no passport for. After the main course, Mr. Ashworth stood to give a toast. It was slick, charming, and filled with inside jokes that drew hearty laughter from his side of the table. Then, he nodded magnanimously in my direction. "And now, I believe William has a few words he'd like to share." It was my turn. I had spent days preparing my speech, carefully writing and rewriting the words on a small set of index cards that I now held in my slightly trembling hand. This was my moment to officially welcome Sophia into our family, to offer a heartfelt, traditional blessing, a father's sincere and loving toast to his only son. I stood up, cleared my throat, and unfolded my notes. "I'd like to begin by saying how overjoyed Eleanor and I are," I started, my voice sounding a little too formal in the suddenly quiet room. Just as I was about to share a fond memory of Alex as a child, Mr. Ashworth leaned over to his wife and whispered something. It was not a subtle whisper, it was a stage whisper, loud enough for half the table to hear. He and his wife chuckled. Sophia, seeing her parents laugh, turned to Alex and made a small, dismissive comment, and he smiled. The spell was broken. Their end of the table came back to life with a low, private murmur of conversation. I faltered, my words catching in my throat. I looked down the long, polished table and saw them, my son, his fiancée, and her parents, completely engrossed in their own private world, their backs metaphorically and almost literally turned to me. They were not listening. They were not even pretending to listen. My speech, my heartfelt contribution to the evening, was being treated as nothing more than background noise. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush of shame that spread from my neck to my face. After a few agonizing seconds of standing there in silence, I quietly folded my notes, placed them back in my pocket, and sat down. No one even noticed. The drive home along the coast was a silent, tense affair. The glittering lights of the city, which had seemed so beautiful from the restaurant window, now felt cold and alienating. Eleanor sat beside me, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her silence a mirror of my own churning thoughts. The sound of the waves crashing on the beach was a rhythmic, mournful counterpoint to the turmoil in my heart. The evening, which was supposed to have been a joyous celebration of family unity, had been a stark and brutal lesson in our new irrelevance. We were no longer the heads of our family. We were simply inconvenient, old-fashioned appendages to the grander, more important Ashworth dynasty. When we got home, the argument, or rather, the discussion, finally began. Eleanor, ever the peacemaker, tried to downplay the incident. "They were just being thoughtless, William," she said, her voice heavy with a weariness that I knew was just a mask for her own deep hurt. "They're young, self-absorbed. And the Ashworths, well, they're not known for their subtlety. It wasn't a deliberate attack. But I saw it for what it was. It was a clear, unambiguous message. It was a dismissal not just of my speech, but of my role, my values, my entire life. It was a quiet, polite, but utterly definitive act of erasure. I went into my study and closed the door. On my desk, in a pristine, embossed folder, was the contract for Glenview Manor. It was the most exclusive wedding venue in the state, a historic estate with rolling hills and manicured gardens, with a waiting list that was 3 years long. Alex and Sophia had fallen in love with it, but had been told it was impossible to book on such short notice. I had made one phone call, to the owner, an old friend and a man whose own business I had helped to save decades ago. I had pulled in the biggest favor of my life. I had secured their dream venue for them, a gift that was not just about money, but about my own history, my own influence, my own hard-won respect. I opened the folder and looked at the contract again. The deposit, a sum that would make most people's eyes water, was, as I well knew, completely non-refundable. It was a gesture of absolute commitment, a testament to my joy and my wholehearted support for their union. I had pictured the wedding day in those gardens, had imagined my son and his new wife standing under the ancient oak tree, surrounded by their loved ones. I had pictured myself giving a toast, the one I never got to give, my words finally being heard, my blessing finally being received. That picture was now a cruel, bitter fantasy. A cold, hard clarity settled over me. They had ignored my words. They had treated my contribution to their engagement dinner as if it were worthless. They had made it clear that my voice, the voice of their father, had no value in their new, glittering world. So be it. I would respond in a language they could not ignore. I would respond not with angry words, but with a quiet, decisive, and irreversible action. If my contribution was not valued, then my contribution would be withdrawn. All of it. I picked up the phone. It was time to cancel the dream. The next morning, I made the call. My old friend, the owner of Glenview Manor, was surprised and concerned. "William, are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice full of a genuine worry. "The date is gone if you cancel. You'll never get it back. And the deposit, you know the policy." I assured him I was certain that unforeseen circumstances had arisen. I didn't offer any embarrassing details, just a firm, final decision. I followed up the call with a formal email, a simple, declarative sentence that officially severed the booking. The act was clean, quiet, and profoundly satisfying. The foundation of their perfect wedding, a foundation only I could have provided, was gone. My next step was to inform the happy couple. I composed a short, polite email, a masterpiece of cold, corporate efficiency. The subject line was simple: wedding venue. The body of the message was equally brief. "Dear Alex and Sophia," it read, "following the events of last night's dinner, it has become abundantly clear that my contribution to your wedding is not required. To save everyone any further inconvenience or potential embarrassment, I have taken the liberty of canceling the booking at Glenview Manor. I wish you both the very best in your search for a more suitable location." I hit send, without a moment's hesitation. My wife, Eleanor, entered my study just as I had sent the message. She had a look of deep apprehension on her face. "What have you done, William?" she asked, her voice a nervous whisper. I showed her a copy of the email. Her eyes widened, and she sank into the leather chair opposite my desk. "Oh, William," she breathed. "This is a declaration of war. This will cause a schism in the family that may never be repaired." Her role as the family's diplomat was at war with her own sense of being wrong. "Respect is the price of admission to my life, Eleanor," I said, my voice quiet but unyielding. "It is the currency of family. Last night, our son and his future wife, and her arrogant family, showed us that they are bankrupt. They treated me with a level of disrespect I would not tolerate from a stranger, let alone my own child. They get to make their choices. And I get to make mine. This is my choice. I was not a victim in this story. I was not a sad, ignored old man. I was a father, a partner, and a man of substance, and I was about to remind them of that fact. I felt a sense of grim, resolute calm. I had not acted out of a hot-headed rage. I had made a calculated, strategic decision. I had responded to their social and emotional slight with a logistical and financial consequence they could not possibly ignore. They had tried to marginalize me, to push me to the dessert course of their lives. I had just responded by canceling the entire meal. The power dynamic, which had been so skewed in that restaurant, had just been radically, and perhaps permanently, rebalanced. The response was faster than I had anticipated. My phone began to ring less than 5 minutes after I had sent the email. It was Alex. His voice was not the confident, smooth tone of a man comfortable in his new, elite world. It was a high-pitched, frantic sound of pure, disbelieving panic. "Dad? What is this email? Is this a joke? You cancelled Glenview Manor? That's not funny, Dad. You need to call them back and fix this, right now." The immediate assumption that I had made a mistake, that I was a foolish old man who had to be managed, only served to harden my resolve. "There is nothing to fix, Alex," I said, my voice a calm, cold counterpoint to his frantic energy. "And I assure you, it was not a joke. Just as I assume your behavior last night was not a joke. When you, your fiancée, and her family chose to carry on a private conversation while I was trying to offer my heartfelt toast to you, you made a very clear statement. You stated that my voice, my contribution, was worthless. I have simply adjusted my actions to reflect the reality you have created." There was a sputtering on the other end of the line, and then I heard Sophia's voice, sharp and laced with an entitled, arrogant outrage. "William, you cannot do this!" she commanded, her tone one of a person who has never been told no in her life. "We have sent out save-the-date cards. We have vendors booked. Do you have any idea how impossible it is to get that venue? The waiting list is years long." Her concern was not for the family relationship I was trying to address, but for the logistical inconvenience and the social embarrassment my action would cause her. "Oh, I do know how hard it is to get that venue, Sophia," I replied, my voice dangerously quiet. "In fact, I am likely the only person on this phone call who truly understands it. It required a personal relationship of 30 years and the calling in of a significant personal favor to secure it. It was a gift, I had thought, from a loving father to his son and future daughter-in-law. A foundational gift for your new life together. But it seems I was mistaken. My role is not that of a father, but of a convenient vendor, and my services are clearly no longer required." The rest of the conversation was a messy, chaotic blur of their threats, their pleas, and their frantic, desperate attempts to bargain. They tried to apologize, but their apologies were hollow, driven not by genuine remorse but by a desperate desire to get the venue back. I listened to it all unmoved. I had made my stand. The easygoing, endlessly supportive father they had taken for granted was gone. In his place was a man they did not recognize, a man who was quietly, calmly, and completely in control, a man who was demanding respect as the non-negotiable price of his participation in their lives. The weeks that followed were a cold, silent war. There were no more family dinners. The phone calls ceased. A deep, glacial rift had formed between the two families, and I had been the one to create the fissure. The wedding plans, once a source of excitement and joy, were now a chaotic mess, a source of stress and immense conflict. Eleanor was beside herself with worry, her days spent in a state of quiet anxiety, her nights sleepless. She feared I had gone too far, that my single, decisive act had permanently shattered our family. Alex and Sophia, as I had predicted, were thrown into a humbling, real-world lesson in influence and access. They scrambled to find a new venue, a place that could match the prestige and beauty of Glenview Manor. They soon discovered that their money, while substantial, was not enough. The exclusive venues, the ones they desired, were booked not just for months, but for years. They were a young, ambitious couple, but they had no history, no long-standing relationships, no deep roots in the community. They were discovering, in the most painful way possible, the tangible value of the very thing they had so casually disrespected: my name, my history, my connections. During this time, Eleanor and I had a series of long, difficult, and profoundly necessary conversations. She was my sounding board, my conscience, my most trusted advisor. She allowed me to rage, to vent my anger and my hurt. But she also, gently, forced me to look beyond my own wounded pride. "What do you want to achieve with this, William?" she asked me one evening, as we sat on our porch watching a storm roll in from the sea. "Do you want to win? Or do you want your son back?" Her question forced me to confront the fear that was lurking beneath my anger, the terror of being erased, of being deemed irrelevant in my own son's life. A strange thing began to happen. Alex started calling me, not to plead for the venue, but to ask for advice. He was trying to negotiate with another venue, and he was getting nowhere. He tentatively asked me how I would handle it. It was a small, hesitant gesture, but it was an acknowledgement. He was, for the first time, seeing me not as a relic of the past, but as a man of experience, a man whose wisdom had value. Our conversations were stilted and awkward, but they were a beginning. He was starting to see the world of quiet power I inhabited, a world built not on flashy wealth, but on a lifetime of earned respect and trusted relationships. Through these conversations, I saw my son in a new light as well. I saw the deep insecurity that lurked beneath his confident exterior, his desperate desire to impress his new, powerful father-in-law, his fear of being seen as less than. I began to understand that his disrespect had not come from a place of malice, but from a place of weakness. It didn't excuse his actions, but it made them, at least, comprehensible. The cold, hard anger in my heart began to soften, replaced by a more complex, and more painful, paternal sadness. Nearly a month after the fateful dinner, Alex asked if we could meet. He suggested a place, not a fancy restaurant, but a quiet, unassuming coffee shop in a neutral neighborhood, a place that held no history for either of us. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting at a small table in the corner, looking tired and much older than his 30 years. The arrogant confidence was gone, replaced by a quiet, somber humility. This was not the boy who had ignored my speech. This was a man who had been humbled by a harsh dose of reality. He didn't waste time with small talk. He looked me straight in the eye, and for the first time, I saw a genuine, profound remorse in his expression. "Dad," he said, his voice quiet and strained. "I am so sorry. For everything. For the dinner, for ignoring your speech. There is no excuse. I was an idiot. I was so caught up in trying to impress the Ashworths, so intimidated by their world that I forgot who I was. And I forgot who you are." It was the apology I had been waiting for, not a panicked plea, but a simple, honest admission of his own failure. He told me that he and Sophia had been through a crucible in the past month. The chaos of the wedding planning had forced them to have a series of brutal, honest conversations. He told me that he had finally stood up to her, and to her father. "I told her," he said, his voice gaining a new, quiet strength, "that you are my father. That your respect is non-negotiable. And that if she and her family could not show you that respect, then there could be no wedding. Because there would be no family." The crisis had forced him to grow, to choose, to define the terms of his own new family. And he had chosen us. I listened, a wave of relief so profound it almost made me dizzy washing over me. This was what I had wanted, what I had needed to hear. It was not about the venue, it was about the principle. My son had finally understood. I did not immediately offer to call my friend and fix the Glenview situation. The consequences of their actions needed to be real. Instead, I offered him something more valuable. I offered him my advice, my wisdom, my time. I offered him a path back to being my son. We sat in that coffee shop for 2 hours, and we talked more honestly than we had in years. We talked not about the wedding, but about life, about business, about the values my own father had instilled in me. We spoke of the true meaning of respect, a currency far more valuable than the Ashworth's fortune. The father-son bond, a bond that had been stretched to the breaking point, was not just being repaired, it was being reforged into something new, something stronger, something tempered in the fire of a difficult, but necessary, conflict. A few weeks later, a new wedding invitation arrived in the mail. The cardstock was simple, elegant. The names were the same, Alex and Sophia. But the venue was different. It was not the grand, opulent Glenview Manor. It was a small, beautiful contemporary art gallery downtown, a place known for its quiet sophistication and intimate atmosphere. It was a choice that spoke not of social climbing, but of a new, more personal vision for their wedding day. It was, I knew, an act of humility, a concession, and a profound statement of their new priorities. The wedding day was perfect, not because of its grandeur, but because of its sincerity. The ceremony was intimate, the guest list smaller, the atmosphere filled with a genuine warmth that had been absent from their engagement dinner. The Ashworths were there, of course, but they were subdued, their usual arrogant confidence replaced by a polite, almost deferential respect. I learned later, from my son, that Sophia had had her own difficult conversations with her father, and had made it clear that her new family's values would be honored. At the reception, held amidst the beautiful, challenging works of modern art, my son, Alex, stood to give the first toast. But he didn't toast his bride. Not yet. He raised his glass and looked directly at me. "I'd like to propose the first toast," he said, his voice clear and strong, commanding the silent attention of the entire room. "To my father, William. A man of integrity, of strength, and a man who taught me a very difficult, and very necessary, lesson about the meaning of respect." He then invited me to the floor, to give the speech I had never been able to give. I stood before their friends and family, and I delivered my toast, my voice full of an emotion that was no longer hurt, but a deep, abiding love. I spoke of my pride in my son, and I welcomed Sophia into our family with a sincerity that was now, finally, matched by their own. As I finished, my son embraced me, a long, heartfelt hug that said more than words ever could. The relationship had been reset. The foundation had been tested, found wanting, and then, with great difficulty, had been rebuilt, stronger and more true than it had ever been. Respect is the invisible architecture of family. It's the foundation upon which all love and connection are built. But in our modern world of social pressures and shifting dynamics, that foundation is often tested, and sometimes, it is treated with a carelessness that can cause it to crack. Have you ever felt ignored or disrespected by the people you love most? Have you ever had to make a difficult, drastic choice to demand the respect you deserve? Share your story in the comments below. Let's talk about the non-negotiable price of admission to our lives. If this story resonated with you, subscribe, and share it with anyone who knows that sometimes, you have to be willing to walk away from the table to finally be offered a seat of honor.